I didn't shed a single tear that afternoon. I'm 69 years old, and I want to tell you what happened in my kitchen on a Tuesday in October, because if I don't say it out loud somewhere, I'm afraid I'll start believing I imagined the whole thing. My name doesn't matter much, but folks around Asheville call me Mama Tessa. I've lived in the same blue clapboard house on Sunset Drive since 1979. My late husband and I bought it back when interest rates were 18% and we thought we'd never afford a thing in our lives. He passed in 2008, heart attack on a Sunday morning, right between the second hymn and the sermon. I came home from the funeral, sat on the porch swing, and figured the worst thing that could happen to me had already happened. I was wrong about that. Twice. The first time I was wrong was in March of 2014. My daughter showed up at my front door at 7:30 in the evening with a little boy clinging to her leg. She was 26 years old. The boy was 4. She hadn't called. She hadn't texted. She just stood there on my porch with the porch light yellow on her face and she said, "Mama, I can't do this anymore." My grandson was wearing a Mickey Mouse t-shirt 2 sizes too small. He had a juice box clutched in one hand, and the straw was bent flat from where he'd been chewing it. He wouldn't look at me. He wouldn't look at her either. He was staring at the seam where my porch boards met, like there was something inside the wood only he could see. I let them in. I made grilled cheese sandwiches because that's all I had thawed out, and I cut them into triangles because that's how my mother used to cut mine. My daughter ate too. My grandson didn't eat any. He lined up his crusts on the placemat in a perfect row, then turned each one 90 degrees so they all pointed the same direction, and only then did he start taking small bites from the corner of his sandwich. "He does that," she said. Her voice was flat. "He does a lot of things." She told me he'd been diagnosed the previous fall. Autism. She used the word like it weighed 40 pounds. She told me his father had left in December and wasn't coming back. She told me she'd lost her job at the dental office because she kept missing days. She told me she couldn't sleep. She told me she couldn't breathe. She told me she loved him, but she didn't know him, and she was scared every minute of every day, and she was so tired she couldn't remember the last time she'd brushed her own teeth. Then she said, "Can he stay with you, just for a little while, until I get back on my feet?" I said yes. I said yes before she finished asking. I'd already made up the spare room in my head before she'd finished her second sandwich. She left the next morning. She kissed the top of his head, and he didn't react, and she got in her Honda Civic and pulled out of my driveway, and I stood at the storm door holding his little hand and waving, even though he wasn't waving, even though he couldn't have cared less, and I watched her brake lights disappear around the bend by the Hendersons' mailbox. A little while turned into 11 years. For the first 6 months she called, sometimes twice a week, sometimes once. She'd ask how he was eating, whether he was sleeping, whether the new preschool was working out. Then the calls became monthly. Then they became birthdays only. By 2017, she was sending a Walmart gift card in the mail every December, signed in her loopy handwriting, "Love, Mom." No return address. No phone number that worked when I tried it. I'll tell you the boy's name now, because he's the heart of all of this. His name is Theodore, but I called him Teddy from the start, and he liked it, and so Teddy he became. Teddy was not an easy child. I'm going to be honest about that, because I think people who pretend autistic kids are easy are doing autistic kids a disservice. Teddy was hard. He didn't speak a full sentence until he was almost 6. He had meltdowns in the cereal aisle at Ingles that brought strangers running. He couldn't stand the tag in his shirts. He couldn't stand the sound of the vacuum cleaner. He couldn't stand certain shades of green, of all things. The green of dollar bills was fine, but the green of dollars was fine, but the green of broccoli sent him under the kitchen table. But Teddy was also a marvel. And I don't say that the way some grandmothers say their grandbabies hung the moon. I mean, Teddy was, genuinely, the most remarkable mind I have ever been close to in my life. When he was 5, I caught him at the kitchen window watching the bird feeder. He had a notepad. He'd drawn the feeder, and then he'd drawn each bird that landed on it, and beside each bird he'd written a number. Not a name. A number. I asked him what the numbers were. He said that one came twice, that one came 4 times, that one came 4 times, that one came 4 times, that one came once, but he was bigger. He was tracking them. He was 5 years old, and he was running a survey. When he was 7, he taught himself to read. Not the way other kids learn to read, with phonics and patience. He just one day picked up the TV guide and started reading it cover to cover. I asked his teacher how this was possible. She said, Mrs. Bedreau, I have no idea, he just does it. When he was 9, I got him a hand-me-down laptop from my neighbour's son who was upgrading. Within a month, he had taken it completely apart and put it back together. Within 3 months, he was writing little programs in something he kept calling Python, which I thought was a snake, until he sat me down and tried to explain. I didn't understand a word he said, but I sat there and I listened because he was talking. He was looking at the screen, not at me, but he was talking, and that was a gift I wasn't going to interrupt. I want to tell you about the moment I knew, the exact moment I understood that the child I was raising was different in a way the world hadn't caught up to yet. It was October 2018. Teddy was 8 years old. We'd had a long afternoon. He'd had a meltdown at the grocery store because they'd rearranged the cereal aisle, and I was sitting at the kitchen table sorting through the mail with a glass of sweet tea, trying to recover. He came in and sat across from me. He had a piece of notebook paper folded into a square. He unfolded it and slid it across the table. It was a chart, hand-drawn, pencil. Lines and columns and numbers I didn't understand. At the top, in his careful block letters, he'd written Grandma's blood pressure. I hadn't told him about my blood pressure. I'd been taking the pills for 3 years. The bottle lived in the medicine cabinet behind a row of Aleve antacids. He'd never seen me take them, but he'd been watching. He'd been watching me sit down on the porch step instead of bending to pull weeds. He'd been watching me hold the door frame when I stood up from the couch. He'd been watching me push the salt shaker away at dinner. He'd been watching me, and he'd made a chart, and the chart said, more water, less salt, walk 20 minutes. I looked at him. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the wood grain of the table, but his hands were shaking a little, the way they did when he was trying very hard to communicate something important. Thank you, baby, I said. My voice cracked. He flinched at the cracking, because he didn't like voices that cracked, but he didn't get up. He stayed at the table with me until the tea was gone. That was the moment. That was when I knew that what other people called his disability was, in some ways, his greatest gift. He saw what nobody else saw. He noticed what everyone else missed. He cared in a way that didn't look like caring on the outside, but on the inside, my God, on the inside, he cared more than anyone. I want to skip ahead now, because if I tell you everything between 8 and 16, we'll be here until Sunday. But I'll give you the broad strokes. I fought for him. I fought the public school district when they wanted to put him in a classroom that wasn't right for him. I fought the insurance company when they wanted to deny his speech therapy. I fought my own savings account, watching it shrink as the years went on, because Social Security and my husband's small pension only stretched so far. I sold my husband's truck. I sold the silver tea set my mother left me. I refinanced the house once and then a second time. I kept the heat at 64 in the winter and prayed the air conditioner would last one more summer. I made it work. I don't know how, exactly. There were months I cried into the sink while doing the dishes. There were nights I lay awake calculating whether I could afford his shoes and the electric bill in the same week. But I made it work. Because what else was I going to do? He was mine. From the moment my daughter walked out my front door that morning in 2014, that boy was mine. Teddy started building things on the computer when he was 12. By 13, he'd built a little program that helped him organize his school day, because the structure of a regular school day made him panic. By 14, he built a more complicated version, with reminders and color-coded blocks, and a feature that broke down big tasks into small ones. He showed it to his special education teacher, Mrs. Whitfield. She showed it to the technology coordinator. The technology coordinator showed it to her husband, who worked at a startup in Charlotte. The husband called me. I remember it was a Thursday. He said his name was Bertram, something, and he wanted to come up and meet Teddy. He said he thought what Teddy had built was, and I'm quoting him exactly, something the world needs. I didn't trust him. I didn't trust anybody. I told him he could come for coffee on the Saturday, but my grandson was 16 years old, and I was going to be sitting right there the whole time. Bertram came. He was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with kind eyes and a habit of pushing his glasses up his nose. He brought a coffee cake from a bakery in Charlotte. He sat at my kitchen table, and he didn't try to small-talk Teddy. He just opened his laptop and asked Teddy to show him what he'd been working on. Teddy talked for 2 hours. I had never heard him talk for 2 hours about anything. Bertram asked questions. Teddy answered them. Bertram asked more questions. Teddy got up and got his notebook and showed Bertram diagrams I didn't even know he'd drawn. At the end of it, Bertram looked at me. He said, "Mrs. Boudreau, I'd like to invest in what your grandson is building. I'd like to introduce him to some other people. I want to be very clear that he would be the owner of his work. I would be a small partner. There would be lawyers involved and contracts, and we would do this right. And we would do it with his pace in mind. Would you be open to that conversation?" I said yes. I said yes carefully, with conditions, with my lawyer cousin Marvin on speakerphone for 3 subsequent meetings, with a stack of paperwork I read every word of, even when my eyes burned. But I said yes. What Teddy had built, in its simplest form, was an app that helped neurodivergent people manage daily life. Routines, transitions, sensory overload, social scripts, executive function support. He built it for himself, and then he'd kept building it because he kept finding new things he needed it to do, and somewhere along the way, he'd built something that thousands, and then tens of thousands, and then hundreds of thousands of people needed too. By the time he was 16 and a half, the app had been featured in the New York Times, in Wired magazine, and on a national morning show that I taped on a DVR I didn't know how to operate. By the time he turned 17 last spring, the company had been valued at, and I had to read this number 3 times to believe it, $3.2 million. My grandson, the boy who couldn't stand the tag in his shirts, was a millionaire on paper. And that, I assume, is when my daughter saw the article. She showed up on a Tuesday in October 14th. I had just put a chicken pot pie in the oven, the kind I make with the lattice crust, because Teddy likes the way the pattern looks before you cut into it. The doorbell rang. I went to answer it, expecting it to be the mail carrier with a package I'd ordered for Teddy's birthday. It was her. My daughter, standing on my porch like it was 2014 again. Except this time, she wasn't holding a juice box. She wasn't crying. She wasn't apologizing. She was holding a leather portfolio, and behind her, walking up my porch steps, was a woman in a charcoal suit with a briefcase. "Mama," my daughter said, "we need to talk. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters. I didn't feel angry. Not yet. I felt cold. I felt the kind of cold you feel when you step out onto the porch on the first morning of November and the air is sharper than you remembered. My hand was on the doorframe. The smell of the pot pie was drifting out behind me. My grandson was upstairs in his room, with his headphones on, working on something he'd been excited about all morning. "What do you want?" I said. It wasn't a question. I didn't make it a question. The woman in the suit stepped forward. She introduced herself. I'm not going to use her name. She handed me a card. She said she represented my daughter in a matter relating to my grandson's financial interests and parental rights. I let them in. I don't know why I let them in. Maybe I wanted to hear it out loud. Maybe I wanted to hear it out loud. Maybe I wanted to make sure I wasn't dreaming. Maybe a part of me, deep down, wanted to give my daughter one last chance to be a human being. We sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Teddy had slid me a chart about my blood pressure when he was 8 years old. The same table where my daughter had eaten 2 grilled cheese sandwiches the night she walked away. The lawyer opened her briefcase. She laid out documents. She said a lot of words. I'll spare you most of them. The short version was this. My daughter was, in the legal sense, still Teddy's mother. She had never formally terminated her parental rights. I had never formally adopted him. I had been his caregiver, his guardian in practice, but on paper, in the eyes of the law, she was still his mother, and as the mother of a minor child, she had a legitimate interest in his financial affairs until he turned 18. She was asking for custody. She was asking for a financial accounting. She was asking, the lawyer used very polite words for this, but she was asking for control. I sat there. I didn't say anything for a long time. I looked at my daughter. She looked back at me. She didn't look ashamed. She didn't look shave. She didn't look shamed. She didn't look sorry. She looked the way she'd looked in high school when she got caught skipping class and tried to argue her way out of it. Defiant. Already rehearsed. "Why now?" I finally said. She started talking about how she'd gotten her life together, how she'd been sober for 3 years, how she'd been thinking about him every day, how she'd seen the article and realized he needed her, how a young man going through what he was going through with that kind of public attention needed his real mother by his side. I let her talk. I let her finish. I didn't interrupt. When she was done, I said, "He's been right here the whole time. You knew exactly where he was. You had this address for 11 years. She started to answer. The lawyer put her hand on her arm. The lawyer said something about how this was an emotional moment and perhaps we should focus on next steps. I told them to leave my house. I said it once, quietly. The lawyer said something about needing to schedule a follow-up. I said it again, louder. My daughter said something about how I was being unreasonable. I stood up, and I said it a third time, and I'm not a woman who raises her voice, but I raised it then. They left. I closed the door. I went into the kitchen, and I turned off the oven, and I sat down at the table, and I put my face in my hands, and I didn't cry, because I had stopped being a woman who cried over my daughter a long, long time ago. I called Marvin. My cousin Marvin, the lawyer, the one who'd helped me with Teddy's contracts. He came over that same evening. He read the documents. He looked at me over his reading glasses, and he said something I'll never forget. He said, "Tessa, I'm going to be straight with you. This isn't a slam dunk. She's his biological mother. She has rights. We can fight this, and I think we have a strong case, but you need to be prepared. We might not win everything." I went upstairs. I knocked on Teddy's door the way he liked to be knocked on. 3 soft taps and a pause. He took off his headphones. I sat down on the floor by his bed. I told him what had happened. I didn't sugarcoat it. He was 16.5 years old, and he deserved to know. He listened. He looked at the wall, not at me, but he listened. When I was finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "When is the meeting?" I told him there would be a court date. I told him our lawyer would be there. I told him I would fight for him, but I also told him what Marvin had said, that we might not win everything. He thought about this. Then he said, "I want to be there." I told him he didn't have to be. He said, "I know, but I want to be." The court date was 3 weeks later. It wasn't a trial exactly. It was a preliminary hearing about custody and guardianship. My daughter was there with her lawyer. I was there with Marvin. Teddy sat next to me in a navy blue button-down shirt that I had ironed twice that morning because he didn't like creases. My daughter's lawyer made her case first. She painted a picture I almost didn't recognize. She talked about how my daughter had been a young single mother, overwhelmed by a difficult diagnosis. She talked about how my daughter had made the loving choice to entrust her son to her own mother during a period of crisis. She talked about how my daughter had now stabilized, rebuilt, and was ready to step back into her son's life. She talked about how the recent financial success of the app had created complications that required, and I'm quoting, "professional and parental oversight that a woman of my advanced age might not be equipped to provide." I felt my hand tighten on the arm of the chair. Teddy noticed. He reached over and tapped my hand twice. It was the closest he came to holding it. I knew what he meant. Don't. Then Marvin made our case. He was good. He laid out the timeline. He laid out the documentation. He laid out 11 years of school records, medical records, and bank statements showing who had paid for what. He laid out a letter from Mrs. Whitfield, Teddy's special education teacher of 6 years. He laid out a notarized statement from Bertram describing how the business had been structured to protect Teddy's interests. It was strong, but you could feel in the room that the judge was still weighing it. You could feel that biological motherhood carries a weight in the law that's hard to outweigh, no matter how many bank statements you have. Then Teddy whispered something. He leaned over to me and he whispered, very softly, "Just let her talk." I didn't understand at first. I turned to him. He was looking straight ahead. He whispered it again. "Just let her talk. The cross-examination. Let her talk." My daughter's lawyer had finished. Marvin had finished. The judge had asked if my daughter wanted to make a statement directly to the court. She'd said yes. She was sworn in. She was sitting in the witness chair. Marvin had the right to cross-examine her. I leaned over to Marvin. I whispered Teddy's words. Marvin looked at me. He looked at Teddy. He nodded. He stood up. He approached the witness chair. He didn't go after her hard. He didn't try to corner her. He asked her gently to tell the court about her relationship with her son over the past 11 years. He asked her to walk through it, year by year. He asked her what Teddy's favorite food was. He asked her what books he liked. He asked her what sounds bothered him. He asked her what calmed him down. He asked her what his special education plan looked like. He asked her what medications he was on, if any. He asked her the name of his teacher. He asked her the name of his best friend. He asked her, finally, when was the last time she had spoken to him on the phone. She struggled. She tried. She gave vague answers. She named foods he didn't eat. She named a teacher he hadn't had in 4 years. She said he was on medication that he had never been on. She said his best friend was a boy whose name I didn't even recognize. She said the last time she had spoken to him on the phone was, she thought, around Christmas, but she couldn't remember which Christmas. And then Marvin asked her one more question. He asked, "Mom, do you know what your son built? Can you describe in your own words what the application does?" She opened her mouth. She closed it. She opened it again. She said, It's something to do with, organization. For people like him. People like him. People like him." The room went very quiet. The judge made her ruling 2 weeks later. She did not award custody to my daughter. She found that my daughter's 11-year absence, combined with her demonstrated lack of knowledge of her son's daily life, needs, and accomplishments, did not support a finding that reunification was in his best interest. She granted me legal guardianship, which Marvin had filed for as a counter-petition. She noted that Teddy was 16.5 years old and that his own clearly expressed preference, made in writing to the court, was a substantial factor in her decision. She wrote in the order, a sentence I have read maybe 100 times. She wrote, "The court finds that the petitioner has demonstrated a financial interest in the minor child that did not exist prior to the public reporting of the minor child's commercial success. This is concerning." That's all she wrote. But it was enough. I'd like to tell you my daughter came around. I'd like to tell you she sent a letter apologizing or showed up at the door one day without a lawyer. She didn't. She moved to Atlanta, I heard from a cousin. She got a new job. She got engaged to a man none of us have met. Teddy turned 18 in May. He took me out to the seafood restaurant on Patton Avenue, the one with the white tablecloths, and he ordered for both of us because he'd planned it for weeks. He looked at his plate mostly, but he raised his water glass at one point and he said, "Thank you, Grandma." That was all. 3 words. He doesn't say much. He never has. But I'll tell you something. I'll tell you what I think, sitting here in October now, a year after that woman showed up on my porch with a lawyer. I think love is what shows up. I think love is the grilled cheese at 7:30 at night, and the chart about blood pressure and the navy blue shirt ironed twice because creases are intolerable. I think love is the 11 years nobody saw, the 11 years of small, ordinary, impossible Tuesdays. I don't know if my daughter will ever come back. I don't know if I'd open the door as she did. I think I would, because I'm her mother, and that's a thing you can't unmake. But I would open it slowly. I would open it with my eyes open. I would not forget what I saw at that kitchen table. And I would have Teddy upstairs in his room with his headphones on, building the next thing. Whatever the next thing is. Whatever the world hasn't caught up to yet. That's my story. I'm 69 years old, and I didn't cry that day, and I'm not crying now, but I wanted somebody to know. I wanted somebody to hear it. Thank you for listening. I've been sitting on this porch swing every evening since the hearing ended, and I think I finally figured out what I want to say about all of it. 11 years ago, when my daughter set a juice box down on my kitchen counter and walked out my front door, she made a choice. She made it because she was overwhelmed and tired and scared, and I understand all of that, I really do. But it was still a choice. Every morning after that, when she didn't pick up the phone, that was a choice too. Every Christmas card with no return address, every birthday she missed, every school play, every doctor's appointment, every long night I sat up with Teddy when he couldn't sleep because the world was too loud inside his head. Those were all choices, hers and mine. And the law in this country is funny that way. It doesn't always weigh choices. Sometimes it weighs paper. Sometimes it weighs blood. We almost lost because of that, and I want anybody watching to understand that what saved us wasn't luck. It was the 11 years of small, ordinary things I had done that left a trail. Records. Receipts. A teacher's letter. A boy who knew his own grandmother's blood pressure when his own mother didn't know the name of his best friend. That's the first thing I learned. Character is what you build in the dark when nobody is watching, when nobody will ever pay you for it. You don't get to invent it the day you need it. My daughter found that out the hard way on a witness stand in October. The second thing I learned is that intelligence isn't always loud. Teddy whispered 4 words to me in that courtroom. Just let her talk. He's 16 years old. He doesn't look people in the eye. He can't handle the sound of a vacuum cleaner. And he saw the whole situation more clearly than the 3 adults sitting at our table. Real intelligence, I think, is the ability to see what's actually there, not what you wish was there, not what you're afraid is there, what is. The third thing I learned, and this is the one I want to leave you with, is that grit isn't about being strong. I'm not strong. I'm a 69-year-old widow who refinanced her house twice and cried into her kitchen sink more nights than I can count. Grit, the real kind, is just showing up. Tuesday, then Wednesday, then Thursday, then 11 years of Tuesdays and Wednesdays and Thursdays, even when nobody is clapping, even when the person you're doing it for can't say thank you in the way you wish he could. If you love a child, love them on the boring days. If you have a gift, build it quietly. And if somebody walks back into your life because the wind changed, you remember who was there when the wind was cold. That's all I've got. That's everything I know.